Hey, Mike, welcome to the virtual CMO podcast and our live stream. Thanks so much for joining us here today.
Great to meet you, Eric. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, this is going to be great because we love to cover a lot of different topics on this show. And we're going to get into negotiating skills today. And that's a topic we haven't really covered before. So I'm really interested to sort of get into the weeds on you or with you on that. Yeah, no, that's great. So it would be great to just kind of set up the conversation today by giving the audience just a brief background and history on yourself. How did you get started as an entrepreneur and work your way into negotiating?
Sure. So kind of in brief, really, even as a kid, I kind of wanted to kind of run my own business. I'd seen programs on TV in the UK and was fascinated by kind of running a business. But my family had nothing to do with running businesses. We weren't entrepreneurs. We didn't know any entrepreneurs. I think it's important kind of point for your audience and your listeners. Finding mentors in life is really important, and being open to learning. I'm what I call a bit of a lifelong learner.
That's great.
So I'm always learning. I'm always finding out things. I'm always going on courses, trying to educate myself. And so I eventually, at the age of about, where was I? So I was an engineer. I went into engineering school and engineering college, and then I did an MBA. And the MBA kind of changed my career path altogether. And then I got into mainstream consulting, very, very high-end, big-ticket consulting, selling £500,000, £1 million deals when I was at KPMG. And then I went freelancing as a jobbing consultant. And I thought I was an entrepreneur at that point. But actually, I was a freelancer, and that was okay. But the realization of that was really important about how you brand yourself and how you market yourself is, be a specialist, be a niche, do something very unusual for your clients. Don't pretend you're something you're not at the beginning. And I happened to work for a consulting company, and they were looking to sell it, and I bought it off them. And I raised £3.5 million of debt, and back in the day when you could, and I bought the company, and I doubled it in size to 120 people, 20 million revenues, very profitable. And so that's how I kind of got into really being a scale entrepreneur.
It's interesting, and I'd love to get your comments on this, is when you talk about, going into big consulting, KPMG, having an MBA as a background, obviously there's a lot of applicability there, right? There's training that they teach you in business school that applies to the corporate world. But when you sort of are a small business owner, an entrepreneur, how much of that do you think is really useful, and how much of it is a different set of education that you really have to learn? You talked about being a lifelong learner. Have you really found that there are different things that you needed to learn running a business yourself?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the MBA was a critical piece for me. Back to what I said, I was an engineer. Engineering project manager was what my kind of training was. And I wanted to run businesses. So I knew nothing about sales, nothing about marketing, nothing about finance, but knew quite a lot about R&D and operations. And so I did my MBA. And I think anyone that's done an MBA or something like that, when you finish that, you feel like you've got this huge wealth of knowledge that you want to deploy instantly into the world. And of course, it's just a set of frameworks.
Sure.
And what I've learned, all those years later, I'm now 56. So, many years since I did my MBA. But what you learn is that the frameworks are brilliant because frameworks help your thinking. I think Warren Buffett, or Warren Buffett's partner, says, he has like mental models. And it's really important in life to have a mental model that you can put things into to help you make decisions. And that was the kind of change, was that, having the models is one thing, but you've got to apply them in real life situations, because life doesn't work out like the textbooks when you're taught. The biggest thing I learned, Eric, was, finance for me. If I had one message for any entrepreneur that's building a company, understanding cash flow at a granular level is critical. Without that, you have no business.
That's really interesting for me to hear you say that, because I remember when I was an undergrad, there were two classes that really bothered me. One was calculus, because it was like, what is the point of learning calculus? I'm never going to use this. But it was really learning how to think in a different way. That's what it was teaching you. They never really sold it as that, but it was trying to teach you how to think in a more analytical way. And the other one was accounting, because it was the process of doing the books, but it didn't tell you what the numbers meant. So I knew sort of what column to put things in, but is this a good number or is this a bad number? That's something they never went into. And that would have been incredibly valuable.
Exactly right. And I think, when you apply, I was very fortunate. I did my MBA at a place called Cranfield in the UK. And Cranfield's aimed at, typically it gets a lot of engineers and ex-military people that are doing career changes. And so they make it very, very pragmatic for people about how you take your existing experience and turn it into a more commercial environment. And our finance lecturer was outstanding, absolutely outstanding. And I can still walk in now to any FD in any size of company and at least have a conversation.
Yeah.
I'm not going to outsmart them, and don't want to ever outsmart anyone, particularly personally, but I'm not going to outthink them about anything. But what I will be able to do is have a language. I think it gives you a language to talk to someone about. And without that language, without the common framework, how do you talk to a CFO in one of your clients who's talking about, cash flow management, working capital management, the importance of payment terms, all of those things that they talk about, balance sheet movements, how do you have CapEx versus OpEx? Even now, just talking about it, having that conversation with your clients, good example about trading CapEx for OpEx. If someone's backed by a VC, a private equity firm, they often want to improve the bottom line, EBITDA, because you get this multiplier effect when you sell your company.
Yes.
Well, when you're selling your services and when you're marketing your services, if you can package them in a way which is you spend a big chunk of capital, but the operating costs going forward are very low, that's a massive value multiplier for your clients.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't know finance, you wouldn't know to have the conversation.
What's interesting about that to me too is whether you're talking about finance, whether you're talking about marketing or sales, really speaking the language of the people that you're dealing with, whether they're inside the company or prospects or existing customers, speaking their language really helps you find some common ground, right? It helps establish that trust so that you can take the conversation in different directions. But it's so clear if you've got an expertise in one area or the other, and you sort of barge into a conversation where you don't have expertise, it's obvious almost immediately.
It is obvious immediately. And I always say to people, when I'm working with clients or speaking at conferences or just in a workshop together, I know the limitations of my knowledge. I don't tend to stray into areas that I don't understand, but I'm inquisitive. I'll say to people, interesting, Eric, about if you looked at, I'd be fascinated in your views about the last 20 years of marketing, because back in the day, we used to write thought leadership papers and we'd write them and we'd print them and we'd put them in the post and we'd send them to clients, and then clients would read them and they'd phone us. And of course, now that world's changed, and it's changed so dramatically that I don't understand truly digital marketing at all. I know some basic things. I know some basics about social media, but I'm anywhere near being even kind of like professionally competent in those areas. And I think if you looked at CMOs now in their kind of late 30s, mid 40s, I suspect a lot of them are quite challenged by it's moving so quickly. How do they get their head around the old world versus the new world, and how you manage that complex mix?
There was a time when you did those white papers, you could send them out, and somebody would be willing to invest 10, 15, 20 minutes of their time to read through that because it was usually based on some research and some insights.
That's right. Exactly.
Now people want, give me 3 bullet points at the beginning that I can get the gist of what it is. If I really need to, I'll dig into this and look at it further. But it's very hard to get 15, 20 minutes of somebody's time to read through any kind of report like that anymore.
It is. I'd agree. And in fact, what's interesting is these formats. What's happening now is I think people are quite happy to engage in a podcast conversation, a webinar conversation, a small mastermind group where you've got, a dialogue with someone who's got some expertise. They seem more willing to do that than they were maybe like 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people are just so overwhelmed with information, but especially during this time of COVID, people miss connection. And I think whether it's a webinar, whether it's a Zoom conference, a live stream, or Clubhouse has been in the news a lot lately, and in the engagement it's getting, people are just really looking for that engagement. They don't want a lot of information. They want that engagement. Yeah. And, it's interesting because I know that in your background, you've had roles in procurement, and for many small and mid-sized businesses that we typically talk about here on this podcast, maybe they don't have a dedicated procurement officer or somebody within the company that does that. That's the job of the owner, the CFO, or his direct reports to make those kinds of decisions. What do you say to somebody who has procurement as part of their role in terms of how they need to look at engaging with people who are trying to sell them something?
It's a great question. So I think if someone's got one of those multiple hat roles, and one of them is they're the buyer for the supply base of that organization, I think the first thing to do is to say, take a step back, look at the data. The first thing that any procurement person does going into any organization is, what am I looking at? What's the category that I'm looking at? What are the categories of spend that I'm looking at? How much do we spend with different suppliers? How long have these suppliers been with us? What's the scope of works that these suppliers provide? So the first thing is sit, get some data, have a think, and start to visualize that data in a meaningful way. And what you'll probably find in the first time you do that is, if the supply base has not been what I call touched for 5-10 years, not negotiated or looked at, there'll be a tail in all of the categories. And when I say a category, there's marketing, there's infrastructure services, there's IT, there's healthcare. Those are categories in my book. When you look at those, in any size company, you'll see a Pareto curve. So what happens is quite quickly, you get 2 or 3 big suppliers, and then it runs off, and you might have 5 or 10, 20, even 50 smaller suppliers. And the first thing you start doing is saying, I'm probably not getting the best value for money from my company. Maybe I should start consolidating. So for your listeners that are kind of like, in organizations who are the marketing function, the leaders, the CMOs, and they're supporting the sales teams going in to win big pitches with big brands, I'd say as a stakeholder, the procurement team is often not overlooked because everyone knows they exist, but they're not focused on. And yet, if you focused on my agenda as one of the many stakeholders that you're pitching to, and you thought through what's going on, well, if I'm running a process and I'm buying marketing services, for example, I've got a very detailed view inside of what we spend, who we spend it with, how much we spend, what the subcategories are, etc. I've also got a savings target, a really important thing that, again, your audience will have heard of and need to focus on during that preparation phase is, in a big company, if you were selling to P&G, for example, as an SME, P&G will have a big savings target for their procurement team within marketing. Once you understand that, then you start saying, well, what does that look like? Well, savings actually has 3 different categories. I won't bore you with the detail now, but there's nuances behind savings. And if they're looking for savings, you've got to work out, well, how am I going to deliver a solution? How do I, first of all, find out their baseline? And then how do I work out what the solution looks like to give them a saving? And then you go, okay, well, that sounds reasonably complicated. So the next thing you think about is, once you get to the stage of engaging with stakeholders, procurement, the marketing director, and everything's a negotiation once you get past the initial discussions, preparation is the key. The value that's created in a deal that you negotiate, well over half of that value is created away from the table, way before you sit down, way before you start talking, because it's all about the preparation.
So if I play a little bit back in layman's terms, what you're really saying, if you're a business, you're trying to do business maybe with a larger organization that has a procurement team.
Yep.
They have goals, they have objectives. And as part of your sales process, you need to create that win-win, right? You need to create something that's going to allow them to say, I was able to save this amount of money or put together this kind of a package that helps me meet my goals, which may be completely outside the scope of what you would typically talk about when you're talking about your product.
So win-win. Interesting, Eric. I think it's a great topic.
Yeah. Well, let's go into it.
So I'm more and more of the opinion now, 5% of deals that are done or less are win-win.
Really?
Because what happens most of the time is, I'm a professional negotiator, a professional buyer. If I'm facing an organization that is relatively new to this, I'm going to claim far more value than I'm going to yield. And that value comes in terms of the price. It comes in payment terms. It comes in what I'll allow you to do in terms of access to our organization's brand, the scope of works that we agree. And the danger here is that as small companies selling to big companies, if those smaller companies haven't worked out, haven't done all their preparation, their homework in advance, you end up winning a deal that 2 months later, everyone goes, remind us, why did we agree to do all this? Why is this deal so unprofitable? Why is everyone working 14-hour days and we're getting nowhere?
Yeah.
And it's because the negotiation went wrong.
That's interesting too, because we're also in this era of SaaS, right? Where
absolutely
everything is on people's websites, all the pricing, this tier, that tier, sign up for a year, you save 10%.
Yep.
And then we get into, it almost seems like there's no negotiation that's even possible anymore because everything is put out there. But a lot of it revolves around hidden costs too, right? We're going to discount it for year one, and then the renewal comes. Oh, by the way, we're not even going to email you about the renewal. Then suddenly you're renewed for another year at a higher rate. There's a lot of shenanigans that are going on with SaaS businesses.
There are, exactly right. And when I talk to people about, so I do a lot of training, negotiation skills training with organizations. I train commercial teams, sales teams, account managers, account directors. When I start talking about negotiating with their clients, I've built a negotiation preparation templates and some templates and sheets. And I say, look, there's normally in a deal about 6 or 7 negotiation variables that you can start talking to your clients about. And just the fact of writing those variables down, as I say, yes, there's price, but there's scope of works, there's service level agreements, there's access to brand, there's payment terms. I mean, I've got 5 already. When you write all the variables down, I mean, I'm not a DJ, but I love music. But if you look at a DJ's desk, a mixing desk, as you move one lever up, you tend to move the other one down. And the same thing happens in negotiations, is that if your client wants something, so for example, they want to reduce the price, you can say, yep, understood. So we're going to go from 20K a month retainer down to 18K a month retainer. And the next part of the conversation you should be saying is, so let's just work out which part of the scope you want us to reduce. And they'll look at you and go, well, none of it. And you say, well, so you just want me to basically just keep reducing the price, do you?
Yeah.
Well, no, that'd be ridiculous. Yeah. So why don't we agree some objective criteria about what makes a great deal for you and for us? And I say to people, before you start negotiating and get into those traps, agree 3 objective criteria about what a good deal looks like. And most trained procurement negotiators or trained negotiators will go, it's a fair question. So you've obviously done your homework, you've been trained, and you start to level that playing field. And I think that's an important part.
Do you think that enough companies give their people the ability to have that kind of flexibility? Let me give you a great example that I had happen recently to me. I was looking at purchasing some software. It was a SaaS model, but it was just exactly as you described. It was more expensive than I wanted to pay, but it was also for more users than I was ever going to need. Right. And so I said, well, why don't you just reduce the price? And I don't need so many seats of this software. And, they hemmed and hawed, they adjusted it a little bit, but it never got to a point where I felt comfortable with it. And then Black Friday came along and I get this email from them offering a far better deal than we were ever talked about for the full user count, and I was like, why didn't you just allow the salesperson to do that instead of waiting for this promotion to come along?
Yeah. So I think negotiation limits, negotiation ranges, whatever you like to call it. I think for the smaller, more agile SaaS-based companies that are more innovative, they're more flexible. But if you're talking to Salesforce or Oracle or any of those big companies that now have SaaS-based products, they have to put very tight constraints on their pricing model and on their number of seats model, because otherwise they'd have, in their mind, too much variation. The irony is, if you look at the airline industry or the car hire industry, they don't have, well, if you're in row 47, then seat 4 has only got 2 prices. They have endless pricing because it's a dynamic pricing model. Yep. And I wonder if SaaS-based I mean, interesting. I hadn't thought of it, Eric. I wonder if SaaS-based software companies will start to adopt much more of a dynamic pricing model, so that as the market, as the seasons change, as demand changes, then their pricing goes up and down, and you get a price for a period. So you might get a price for 6 months that's discounted against list, and then it reverts back to list. By the way, interesting negotiation tactic for your listeners. If someone starts to beat you up on price and says you're at 20K a month retainer, but I want it down at 15K a month, you could say, we'll do 15K a month for 6 months, after which it reverts to 20K a month, providing we hit our KPIs. And what you do is you limit your downside risk of that price going on forever. And that often gets missed as a negotiation tactic. Time-limited offers.
So making sure that in the contract, you actually put that it is reverting at this time, not that we're going to renegotiate it at that time, because then it can just sort of go on forever.
Exactly right. Yeah. And again, none of these, I always say to people think that procurement's a bit like the police. You know, you have to do what they say.
Right.
But in fact, we're not. We're just negotiating.
Yes.
Everything's a negotiation. There are certain limits that we all have. And then I'll have a BATNA, a best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And when we reach my endpoint, I'll say, I'm done. I can't go any further. And if you try and go beyond that, I'll withdraw. Just knowing what the limits are.
Well, you know, I remember going to buy automobiles with my grandfather and my dad, and the old negotiating trick there is, right, well, we'll just split the difference.
Yeah.
We'll just split the difference. And I'm surprised how many people still think that that's a good negotiating technique is, well, we're just going to split the difference.
We're just going to split the difference. I mean, interesting, Chris Voss, very well-known negotiator in the States, ex-FBI negotiator. You know, he wrote a book called Never Split the Difference.
Never split the difference. Yeah, I remember that.
So, yeah, negotiations, interestingly, negotiations evolved a lot over the last kind of 10, 20 years. But the tools and techniques haven't. You know, I did my negotiation training, 15 years ago at Harvard, which is an amazing course. And if I look at the tools I use now, the principles are still the same as the ones I used then. They're adapted a bit, but the basic premise of negotiation hasn't really changed that much.
Do you advise people to say you should negotiate every deal that you're working on? So, you know, let's keep up with this SaaS model where you go to the website, they've got good, better, best, you know, pricing, you know, 3 tiers, 4 tiers, whatever. And you're like, well, these are my 3 choices. Which one am I going to take? Or do you say, nope, I need to get a salesperson on the phone and start negotiating? What's your advice?
If you can get a salesperson on the phone, definitely get a salesperson on the phone. I did it for, I won't name the product, it's not fair on them, but I did it for a SaaS-based provider about a year ago. And like you, I didn't want to have 10 user licenses. My client needed 3. And I found a salesperson and we had a discussion. And sure enough, we got a special deal. Because they have these reserved deals. They just don't put them on their website. But I said, look, I can sign a contract in half an hour if you send it to me now, if you do this price. And they went, well, they did the car salesman trick, Eric. I'll have to go and talk to my manager. So they put the phone down, obviously, for a minute. They made a coffee and they had a walk around. And then they came back and said, you know what? They've said yes, but no one else gets this deal. It's special to you. I'm like, that's fine. Okay.
That's interesting to me too, because, you know, working closely with a lot of sales organizations, some of these things, they just seem so common across all businesses where there's this reluctance. Oh, I have to go check with my manager. And then the old, you know, let's do every deal at the end of the month, or especially, you know, the last month of the quarter. So that, exactly. And it just seems like, why can't businesses get out of this cycle? There's so much frantic activity at the end of a month, or especially the end of a quarter, to get things done. It's like, why not push that out a little bit more throughout the quarter?
And again, a great tactic is that if you're a supplier selling into big companies, and internally within your organization, you've got quarterly quotas and you've got to hit your numbers, one of the best things you can do is stop that from a sales comp scheme point of view. Because the moment I, as a buyer, I suspect, as you say already, that you've got an end of quarter or an end of year problem. And I'm going to negotiate with you when it suits me.
Sure.
So if in that conversation you say to me, Mike, just so we're clear, by the way, we've done away with end of quarter, end of year quotas. So whenever you talk to me, we're going to negotiate a very similar deal. Now, I might or might not believe you, but it's a good starting point.
Yeah, because it can really stall out a lot of negotiations, right? Because everybody knows there's no point in doing this now. I'll get a much better deal if I just wait a couple of weeks.
Correct. And again, the research that you do, if you're selling into public companies, they are bound by very strict governance rules as a listed company. And that's a great thing to do because you can find out loads of information about that company on the web. The web's such a wonderful tool now for research. I used to have to go down to the library. I don't even know if they exist anymore.
Exactly. To research company. Yeah, you can find out what other people are paying. You can see reviews. You can even, look back and see when they've run promotions or other things like that. Yeah, there's so much information out there that helps you as a buyer.
Exactly. Yeah, and as a seller.
Yeah.
As a seller, same thing. When you're doing your preparation as a seller, really important to do your research about what's happened to that company in the last kind of 12 months, what's been going on. Read the annual reports, look at their websites. Simple thing. If you are facing off against a negotiation, against a procurement person, by the way, so if one of your audience is in the sales stream, they're a sales leader, they're negotiating a big deal with a Fortune 500 company, and you get told to go and see procurement, obviously you'll look at their LinkedIn profile, everyone does. But look for something specific. When you look at a procurement person's LinkedIn profile, look down the list of jobs they've done. If they spent 10 years in procurement and 8 of those years were in FMCG and they were buying what they call direct goods, so they were a buyer, they were buying bananas, apples, clothing, be really wary. These are highly trained negotiators.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Very, very, I wouldn't say aggressive, but very pointed in their negotiations because every cent that you save counts in a large retailer or a large FMCG company. And so if someone in procurement's been in direct goods and they're now in indirect, because marketing is an indirect service.
Okay.
They've switched from direct into indirect. Just do a lot more preparation and be really well prepared. They will be very tough adversaries and it will not be win-win.
One of the perceptions that I've often had when dealing with procurement people is it's sort of like uploading, the essence of your resume to some automated HR service. You spend hours and hours trying to craft this document that sets you apart. And what they want to do is they want to strip all that out and just get down to the basics. And sometimes it feels like that when you're negotiating with a procurement person because they don't want all your lovely collateral and all the work that you put in to make your product stand out. They want you to fill out a spreadsheet with a bunch of line items that makes you look exactly like your competitors. So how do you win in scenarios where a lot of what you feel makes you unique feels like it gets stripped out as part of the process of negotiating?
This is a great topic. So when you're in that scenario, in procurement, by the time you meet me, I assume that you've done your job. Let's say it's marketing because it's an easy topic. Let's say that you've been negotiating with the CMO. I assume the reason you're with me is because the CMO really rates you. She thinks you've got a brilliant proposition, that you can deliver real value to the organization, and that you're on the short list. So when you come and see me, bringing all the same collateral to me that you've brought to the CMO isn't going to help. Because I'll say, look, I assume you've done that, or else why are you here?
That's a good point.
So when you come and see me, you need to recut your stakeholder pack and start to think about a few things. So I've written something called, very simple, it's called the procurement success equation. I'm an engineer by training, Eric, as we said. So I like equations, I like maths. So if I'm a procurement person, success is defined as, yes, it's about price and savings, but it's about reliability. So it's savings plus reliability, plus quality, plus sustainability, because I need to know that what you're doing is ethical and sustainable. And it's about risk on the bottom line. So I add up the top ones and then I divide it by risk. So when you see me, you've got to try and convince me that you're a low risk solution. This isn't going to go wrong. that you're reliable, that you aren't going to just suddenly fall over, that I can get a high quality outcome and we can agree some service level agreements and KPIs to measure against that. That your supply chain has been audited and that we know that we can rely upon as not being held to account because of your poor service around how you manage your supply chain. And the moment you just look at even that one simple equation, you've now got 5 or 6 things you can talk to procurement about, which are outside of the value proposition that you're selling. And now you've got my attention.
Well, and I suppose this is especially true if you're a smaller vendor, maybe going up against some established players that right out of the gate, their risk profile is going to be much lower than yours. So
Correct.
You've got to sort of weight these other things a little bit higher.
That's right. And it's about balancing that equation until an acceptable outcome for procurement.
That's very interesting.
Too often people get trapped into it's only about price. And it's not. Anyone that says that procurement only care about price haven't met procurement, or they've met them, they haven't bothered to understand them.
That's really interesting. And now, you started out this conversation talking about the fact that you invested, you bought your own consulting company, and that's what you're running today. So you teach people how to do this. This is part of what your offering is.
Yeah.
Share with the audience a little bit about what you do.
Yeah, sure. So what I do now is that I work with organizations that are selling into big companies, smaller companies selling into big companies. And typically they're, kind of $10 million turnover to $200 million turnover. And those suppliers, I work with them to help their sales teams and their account management teams become better negotiators so they do better deals with their clients, especially when procurement's involved. So I run training, I run coaching, I write loads of contents. I've done a video today as well that I've released. I write a regular column for something called The Drum, which in the UK and the US is a big media platform. And it's there's a column called Ask the Negotiator, and that's me. And each month I write something about a negotiation scenario within the marketing field.
I think this is so timely because obviously with a lot of publicly traded companies, especially, there just seems to be this constant chiseling away at expenses where they're looking to save money to make their balance sheets look good. But real negotiating skills can make such a difference because I think sometimes people are just scared. There's a mental hesitation, I think, on some people's part to negotiate because they don't feel they're well equipped to do it. They feel scared, that they might walk in and look stupid. But it's important to know when is an appropriate time to negotiate because it can amount to some significant savings.
Absolutely. There's no surprise that when the surveys were done across a lot of US companies that were listed and European companies, the ones that had the highest growth rates in net profit and were the most profitable had trained negotiators inside on both the selling side and the buying side. There's a direct correlation between negotiation maturity and profitability.
And that's really an interesting point, and we can end on that one. But it is not just your procurement team who needs to have the negotiating skills. It's also your sales team, right? Because they're negotiating from a different standpoint. Yeah. Critical. Hey, Mike, if you could, I'd love for you to leave some information where people can find you on the web and on social media, and we will also make sure to hook all that stuff up in our show notes. Yeah,
I'd love to, definitely. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, so where can people find you on the web?
Best thing to do is look at piscari.com, Piscari, piscari.com/guide. There's a guide there they can download.
Hey, that's excellent. We will make sure to link that up in the show notes so that people can find you. This is, like I said, it's a fascinating topic, something that we haven't really covered on the show before. And I really encourage people to check out your website and the blogs that you write because there's a lot of fine tips in there and things that people really should start implementing in their business.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. Thanks, Mike.